good evening, and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be reading to you this magazine book. Not quite sure what, a little informational thing. It is the Atlas of War, from ancient battles to modern warfare. And I've actually covered some of the wars and battles in this book in my videos, so whenever they come up, I'll link a card to it if you want to see more about it in a relaxing ASMR voice. So this is kind of long, so let's dive right in and read about the wars. I'm going to use this as a pointer. Atlas of War. Starting off with classical empires. We're starting off with the Persians at the gates. In the 6th century BCE, the Mediterranean basin bustled with activity. The rocky Greek peninsula alone was home to hundreds of independent city-states, though only a few, such as Athens and Sparta, had substantial populations. Greek powers had established colonies from Spain to the Black Sea. Inevitably, these Greek settlements came into conflict with the powerfully expansionist Persian Empire across the Aegean. Persia managed to absorb some Greek colonies on the coast of Asia Minor, but in 499 these restive cities tried to break away and drew upon allies in mainland Greece for aid. The Persians crushed the revolt, but did not forget the insult. According to Greek historian Herodotus, in 491, Persian Emperor Darius I sent envoys to Athens and Sparta, asking for a tribute of earth and water, symbols of submission. The Athenians threw the heralds into a pit. The Spartans hurled theirs into a well, and told them to take their earth and water from there. The following year, Persia launched the first of 2 attempted invasions of the Greek mainland in what were to become some of the most famous conflicts in early history. Starting with Marathon. Powerful Persia had a large army and navy, and in 490, Darius sent 600 ships and up to 25,000 soldiers, including cavalry, across the Aegean to the city of Eretria. Besieged, Eretria quickly surrendered, led by a Median admiral Datis. The Persians then moved on to the plain of Marathon, some 24 miles north of Athens. Understandably worried, the Athenians called upon Sparta for aid, but were turned down as the Spartans were observing a religious holiday. 10,000 Athenians marched to Marathon with only 1,000 allies from the city of Plataea to aid them. Greek armies consisted primarily of foot soldiers called hoplites, armed with spears, shields, and swords, and protected by armor. The Persians were more lightly clad, but were known for their skilled archers as well as their cavalry. After a delay of several days, while the Athenians were still hoping to receive Spartan reinforcements, the Athenian general Miltiades made a bold decision: attack the Persian lines head-on at a run. Charging forward in heavy armor, the Athenians surprised their opponents and crushed them at close quarters. Persian soldiers fled to their ships. Herodotus says that 6,400 Persians and only 192 Greeks died in the battle. Possibly a patriotic exaggeration, but the victory was decisive nonetheless. Then Thermopylae. Their win at Marathon brought the Greeks 10 years of relative peace. They knew, however, that Persia was intent on another attempt. And so, in an unusual show of cooperation, many of the squabbling city-states formed an alliance known as the Hellenic League. In Persia, Xerxes I succeeded Darius I. This time in 480, instead of sailing directly to the Greek mainland, Xerxes marched his army around the coast and down the peninsula toward Athens. It was a large force for the time, perhaps 75,000 soldiers supported by a navy. The Athenians also had a skilled navy, but the combined Greek forces were much smaller than the Persians, amounting to roughly 7,000 hoplites. Led by Spartan king Leonidas, the Greeks massed at the pass of Thermopylae north of Athens. Just 50 feet wide in those years, the narrow defile between the mountains and the sea formed a bottleneck that allowed Greek hoplites to hold off the vast Persian forces for several days, while cities to the south were evacuated. Then they were betrayed. A Greek defector showed the Persians a goat track through the mountains that allowed them to circle around their enemies. Seeing the end approaching, Leonidas ordered all soldiers except his 300 Spartans and a handful of others to retreat. Standing alone at the pass, they died to the last man. There's also cool maps down here showing all the paths people took when they invaded and things like that. So maybe another night, because this video will be like 4 hours long if I do it, we can trace all the different paths like that, because that's also really tingly. Let me know if you're interested in that. Let's read about Salamis. After his victory at Thermopylae, Xerxes marched his armies south, only to find most of the cities abandoned. The Persians sacked and burned the empty city of Athens, and then turned their attentions toward the sea, where they hoped to overcome the Greek fleet. According to Herodotus, the Greek commander Themistocles tricked the Persians by sending them secret messages, claiming that the Greeks were about to escape. This spurred the Persians into sending their fleet through a narrow channel near the island of Salamis. Hidden from view, Greek triremes ambushed the larger Persian fleet and sent them packing, losing only 40 ships to the Persians' 300. The Battle of Salamis effectively won the Greco-Persian conflict for the Greeks. The Persians, weakened over the winter, were finally defeated at the Battle of Plataea in 479. We have China's warring states, which I've been working on practicing pronouncing Chinese things, so if I get something wrong, do let me know if you know the correct pronunciation. The period from 475 to 221 BCE is aptly called the Warring States period. In the centuries leading up to 221, the land known as China was a jigsaw puzzle of feudal states headed by regional kings and lords. Within walled cities, rulers made and quit alliances, plotted assassinations, and built up their own armies. Farmers were drafted into the ranks by the thousands and armed with crossbows. With the added accuracy of these bronze-triggered weapons, even a peasant could be a deadly opponent, and those who achieved success on the battlefield were rewarded with increased social status. By the 4th century BCE, most of the quarreling states had consolidated into 7 major powers: Qin, Qi, Zhou, Yang, Han, Wei, and Zhao. Qin lay farthest to the west. Other large states, such as the powerful Wei in the Central Hills and Qi to the east, looked down on the western state as a barbarian-filled backwater. But when Shangyan, an ambitious statesman, left Wei and offered his services to the ruler of Qin in 361 BCE, the provincial state began to reorganize and cast its eyes on its neighbors. Shanyang became the state's de facto ruler. Though he was a despot who encouraged neighbor to spy upon neighbor, he was also an able administrator whose reforms built Qin into the powerful state that would eventually dominate the region. In 340, Qin attacked and subdued Wei, which had been weakened by previous assaults from its neighbor Han. Unfortunately for Shanyang, this was the end. The ruler who had protected him died, and his heir, King Huiwen, had a long-standing hatred of the minister. In 338, Shanyang was arrested. He was reportedly tied to 4 chariots driven off in different directions and torn apart. The Battle of Chongping. The wars continued as Qin grew stronger. After Qin defeated Zhou in 278, it eventually turned to Zhao to the north. Zhao General Lampo held off Qin forces at the pass of Chongping, near present-day Gaoping, for 3 years. But Zhao's king Xiaochang grew impatient and replaced him with a new general, Zhao Kuo. As the Zhao armies advanced, the Qin forces retreated. But Zhao Kuo made a fatal error. Chasing after the Qin troops, he left his supply lines behind. The Qin forces then circled around the Zhao army and cut it off. Trapped against Qin fortifications, the Zhao army starved. After 46 days, Zhao Kuo tried one last time to break out and was killed by enemy arrows. The rest of the army, reportedly 400,000 strong, surrendered to the Qin. According to Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, the Qin didn't trust the prisoners not to betray them later. All were executed save 240 men, sent home to spread word of the devastating defeat. Although wars continued for several more decades, Qin was clearly on the road to victory. In 221 BCE, Qin's ruthless leader King Zheng became Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of unified China. There's the famous terracotta warriors that are buried with him. Alexander moves east. Briefly united to combat the Persian menace, Greek city-states pulled apart again in the late 5th century BCE. Fighting between factions led by Athens and Sparta left the cities weakened and vulnerable to a new threat from the north, King Philip of Macedon. Philip had built an outstanding army consisting of mixed forces, including skilled cavalry and heavy phalanx, 16 ranks deep, and armed with 13-foot-long spears called sarissas. Rigorously trained, the troops could travel at speed up to 15 miles a day. By 338 BCE, Philip had subdued the states to his south and turned to Persia. When Philip was assassinated in 336, his 20-year-old son Alexander inherited his throne and his ambitions. Already an experienced warrior, Alexander wasted no time in taking charge of Macedon's army and launching it on a lightning offensive through Persian territories and into India, a journey of unbroken conquest considered one of history's greatest military campaigns. First was Issus. A brilliant tactician, Alexander invaded the Persian Empire in 334 BCE and wrested one formerly Greek city after another from Persian rule. Some he won by battle, others surrendered as he approached. In 333, Alexander left 6 soldiers to recover in the town of Issus, near the southern coast of present-day Turkey, and marched south. Persian King Darius III swept in behind him and massacred the troops left behind. Alexander then reversed course and met Darius's forces on the coastal plain near Issus. Darius fielded perhaps 100,000 to 200,000 soldiers, including cavalry and infantry, against Alexander's 40,000 or so troops. Alexander himself led the elite cavalry corps known as the Companions. Charging toward the Persian left wing, Alexander's cavalry broke through the enemy lines and attacked the Persian center. Terrified, Darius III fled the battlefield, leaving behind not only his weapons and cloak, but also his wife, mother, and children who had accompanied him on his campaign. Alexander's victory was complete. Then Gaugamela. Alexander marched on, conquering the eastern Mediterranean coast and continuing into Mesopotamia. In 331, his army met that of Darius on a field near the town of Gaugamela in present-day Iraq. Darius's army must have been an imposing sight, vastly outnumbering the Macedonians. It included chariots with scythed wheels as well as war elephants, deployed on ground that Darius had cleared for battle. The first stages of the battle were hard fought, but after a strategic delay, Alexander led his cavalry across the Persian left flank, through a gap, and turned it against the Persian center. Again, Darius fled, and Alexander's army took the day, as well as the elephants. Gaugamela was a fatal blow to the Persian army. From 331 to 327, Alexander marched into Babylon, Persepolis, and on toward India, the edge of the old Persian Empire. Here, however, his weary troops rebelled. In 323, he was forced to turn back toward Mesopotamia, where he died in Babylon at the age of 32, possibly from a fever, leaving behind a string of cities bearing his name. It's a big map of his conquests. Maybe we'll look through that another day. The road to empire. At its peak in the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire encompassed almost the entire Mediterranean from Spain through Syria to what is now Tunisia. To the north, it occupied what is now France, parts of Germany, and Britain. Able administration and skilled labor helped Romans make a home in remote places, but taking and holding these lands in the first place required the greatest military force ever assembled, the Roman army. Although the army's organization changed somewhat over the centuries, at its core were the versatile infantry units known as maniples, I believe, which were eventually grouped together as legions, armed with 7-foot javelins and heavy swords that protected. By helmet, shield, and breastplate, the legionnaires attacked line by line, hurling the javelins and following up with their blades. The strongest fighters, the veterans, brought up the rear. Led by centurions, legionnaires were paid regularly, well-trained, and well-supplied. They were ferocious against their enemies and almost as ferocious against weakness in their own ranks. Decimation, for instance, involved executing 1 out of every 10 members of a misbehaving cohort. The soldiers were also hard-working and practical. Engineers accompanied the troops, laboring with them to build mile upon mile of roads, walls, forts, and bridges. Over the centuries, they outlined the empire in stone and concrete. The Punic Wars. Beginning in the 3rd century BCE, when Rome was still a republic governed by an aristocratic senate, the Roman military met its first great test in a series of wars with the North African city-state of Carthage. Carthage was a wealthy commercial empire that held considerable power in Spain, North Africa, and Sicily. The expanding Roman state had designs on Sicily as well. And in 264 BCE, the two powers went to war over the island. Unlike most of Rome's subsequent victories, the First Punic War, so called because the Romans knew the Carthaginians as Poni, which comes from, what were they, the Phoenicians, was decided mainly at sea. After more than 20 years of fighting in Mediterranean waters, North Africa, and then Sicily, Rome finally won possession of the island and followed up by annexing Corsica and Sardinia. Although the First Punic War ended in defeat for Carthage, it resulted in the rise of a new power within the African state, the Barca family. General Hamilcar Barca commanded troops in Sicily and Spain until his death in 228 BCE. He was succeeded by his 2 sons, Hannibal and Hasdrubal, who went on to lead Carthaginian armies during the Second Punic War from 218 to 202 BCE. The dispute this time began over territory in Spain, but escalated to land wars in Italy and North Africa. It was marked by one of the most famous marches in history, Hannibal's rapid foray through Spain and Gaul, over the Alps, and into the Italian peninsula. His 30,000 men were accompanied by war elephants and allies picked up along the way. The Battle of Cannae. Following a series of successful battles, Hannibal went on to trounce Rome's army in 216 in one of that vaunted force's worst defeats. Near the fortress of Cannae, Hannibal shaped his troops into an unconventional formation with the weakest spot in the middle and stronger forces on the flanks. As the Romans charged, the Carthaginian center fell back, while their stronger infantry and cavalry swung around and enveloped the Romans on either side. The result was a massacre, with some 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers killed as they fought or tried to flee. Despite Hannibal's victories in Italy, Rome, under General Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus, was racking up gains behind his back. Roman forces retook land in Spain, sailed to North Africa, and threatened Carthage itself. Hannibal was forced to return to his home city, where he lost to Scipio in the hard-fought Battle of Zama in 202. The Third Punic War, from 149 to 146, sealed the city's fate. Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, besieged and razed the city, though chroniclers say he wept at the sight. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Rome continued to expand, gaining considerable ground to the north, with Julius Caesar's triumph over Gallic tribes in the 50s BCE. Augustus succeeded Julius as the Republic became empire, with Augustus efficiently reorganizing the military into a body that reported directly to him. Conquests included various tribes in the forests of Germania, roughly present-day Holland and to Poland, who appeared to be adapting to the Roman way of life. In CE 7, when Publius Quintilius Varus became governor of the German provinces, he trusted that the tribes would continue to submit and not incidentally pay Roman taxes. Not so. In the year 9, a young German chieftain known as Arminius, leader of the Cherusci tribe, played a deadly trick on Varus. As a supposed ally of the Romans, Arminius told the Roman leader that certain other tribes were rising up in rebellion to the northwest. Varus confidently marched out with 3 legions to subdue the supposed rebels. As the Romans struggled through forests and ravines, Arminius departed, claiming he needed to fetch his own forces in support. A storm blew up, writes Roman historian Cassius Dio, as the barbarians suddenly surrounded them on all sides at once. Beset, Romans fought Germans for 4 days through the difficult terrain, only to be literally bogged down in a swamp. They were overcome. Varus fell on his sword, and other soldiers followed suit or tried to flee, only to be killed. Every man and every horse was cut down, Dio writes. These legions, amounting to almost 20,000 Romans, were wiped out. Stories, possibly apocryphal, arose that when Augustus learned of the disaster, he tore his clothes and took to smashing his head against a door, wailing, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It sounds very Augustus. The legions never returned. Obviously, Roman expansion was forced to a halt at the Rhine and Danube rivers, where a long line of forts and watchtowers marked the limits of Rome's power in the northern wilderness. In 410, the Visigoths invaded Rome from the unconquered territories and put an end to the Western Roman Empire. Moving on to conquests and crusades. Starting with the Norman conquest. It is rare that a single battle marks a major turning point in a culture, but the Battle of Hastings in 1066 was that kind of transition. The key conflict of the short, successful Norman conquest was not just a military victory, it was a reworking of England's national identity. That said, national identity in medieval England and France was a confused web of warring lords and disputed claims. Normandy, across the Channel from England, had been settled by Vikings. England was a mix of Anglo-Saxons and Danes. Nobles in England and Normandy were often related. For instance, the English ruler Edward the Confessor was a cousin to the Norman Duke William the Bastard. The Normans later claimed that the childless Edward had promised William he should be his heir. True or not, another contender for the English throne arose in the person of Harold Godwinson. A powerful Anglo-Danish nobleman, Harold was an able general and Edward's right-hand man. In 1064, Harold's ship was blown ashore on Norman territory, and Harold eventually fell into William's custody. Again, according to Norman accounts, Harold swore an oath to uphold William's claim to the English throne and was returned safely to England. However, when Edward died in early 1066, the Witan, the Council of Anglo-Saxon leaders, named Harold King of England. William was furious and planned an invasion to claim the kingship. Here he comes. The Battle of Hastings. Harold knew that William was coming and assembled an army of some 3,000 or so housecarls, elite guards equipped with two-handed battle axes, and about 4,000 others, mostly part-time soldiers provided by his lords. William's roughly 400-ship invasion force carried some 7,000 soldiers as well, including archers and mounted warriors. After a weather delay of some weeks, the winds turned fair, and simultaneously Harold faced a new threat. His brother and bitter enemy Tostig had joined forces with Harold Hardrada king of Norway, to invade the north. Harold was forced to march his soldiers at speed to York to meet the invaders. The Norsemen fought fiercely. At one point, the English advance was held off by a single Viking who reputedly killed 40 enemies defending Stamford Bridge until an English soldier who floated under the bridge stabbed him through a chink in the planks and dispatched him. No sooner had Harold defeated the Viking threat that he learned that William had landed at Pevensey on the southeastern coast. Hustling his tired troops back south, he took up a position on the hill of Senlac, near the town of Hastings. On October 14th, the two sides clashed. Norman archers showered the English with arrows. The English shield wall held them back. Eventually, Norman forces wore down the axe-wielding English, and Harold himself was killed, apparently by an arrow through his eye. By the end of the day, the Normans had won the field. William faced little opposition after Hastings. On Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned William I of England. With his rule came an overhaul of English nobility, law, the church, and speech itself, as French and Latin wove themselves into the fabric of the English language. Into the Holy Lands. Shifting borders, poverty, religious fervor, and armed knights make for a troublesome brew. In the 11th century, much of Europe and the eastern Mediterranean was in ferment. Muslim powers had conquered formerly Christian territory in the east, including Jerusalem, occupied as of 1071 by Seljuk Turks. Western Europe, with its growing population, was a feudal quilt of castles and quarrelsome knights who were not above raiding nearby villages. Struggling to control their unruly flocks, the Catholic Church under Pope Gregory VII and his successor, Pope Urban II, decided to divert popular energies to a useful goal, retaking Jerusalem and the lands around it. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Urban II issued a challenge. Western warriors should take up the cross, become soldiers of God, and reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslims. Let those who for a long time have been robbers now become knights, he is reported to have said. The response was overwhelming, long-lasting, and chaotic. From 1096 until the end of the 13th century, tens of thousands of pilgrims and soldiers made the difficult journey to the Holy Land in 8 crusades and sundry conflicts in between. For the Christians, the most victorious moments came in the earliest crusades, when they briefly established Christian strongholds before Islamic powers and regained the embattled territory. From Europe to Jerusalem. More than 100,000 devout Europeans started out in answer to Urban II's call, many of them women and the elderly, and most of them poor. The Seljuk Turks effectively wiped out most of these untrained civilians before they reached the final battlegrounds. Better suited to the quest were Europe's armed knights, wealthy nobles who could afford horses, armor, weapons, and their own infantry. In 1097, advancing into Anatolia, the Crusaders got their first taste of the difficulties of Middle Eastern warfare. The land was parched, and by the time the knights settled in for a siege around the walls of Antioch, they were reduced to eating dogs, rats, and even seeds picked out of manure. In 1098, treachery did what a siege could not. The crusader Bohemond bribed a Turkish guard into admitting them over the walls, and Europeans poured into the city and took it over. Antioch did not provide much sustenance for starving crusaders, but Bohemond insisted on remaining as its ruler while the other soldiers moved on to Jerusalem. When they reached the Holy City in the summer of 1099, they were down to about 1,500 mounted men and 12,000 infantry. Jerusalem's governor had poisoned the wells around the city, leaving the invaders camped outside in dire straits. Relief arrived in the form of 6 European ships. Using scavenged wood and the timbers of the ships themselves, the Crusaders built ladders, catapults, and siege towers that they rolled up to the city walls. With these aids, they took the city on July 15th. The Crusaders were brutal in their conquest. Men, women, and children, Muslim and Jewish, fell to swords and fire. Jerusalem became one among several Crusader states, but remained in European hands only until 1187 and the arrival of a Muslim champion. The Battle of Hattin. A second crusade from 1147 to 1149, led by the kings of Germany, France, and the Crusader state of Jerusalem, failed miserably to achieve the goal of taking Damascus. Within 20 years, crusading prospects grew even dimmer with the rise of al-Malik al-Nasir Salah ad-Din Yusuf, known as Saladin in the west. A devout man and a resolute fighter, Saladin managed to unite several Muslim territories under his control in the 1170s and 1180s. In 1187, after a Christian leader broke a truce, Saladin declared war and besieged the Crusader city of Tiberias near the Sea of Galilee. Jerusalem's King Guy unwisely decided to march his 20,000 soldiers across the desert to meet Saladin's army, 30,000 strong. The terrain itself proved to be the Christians' greatest enemy. Struggling across a waterless desert in July, the Crusaders were exhausted and desperately thirsty when they took up a stand on the horns of Hattin, an extinct volcano. Saladin's army wiped out repeated Crusader attacks until only a core group of knights and the king's tent remained on the hill. According to Saladin's son al-Malik al-Afdal, I screamed, "We have beaten them," but my father turned to me and said, "Silence, we will have crushed them only when that tent has fallen." Fall it did. Saladin spared King Guy while turning to reconquering Crusader states, including Acre, Ascalon, and then Jerusalem on October 2nd. Although crusading armies advanced and retreated through Muslim territories for another 85 years, they never again seized full control of the lands they coveted. By the mid-13th century, both sides faced a new enemy, the Mongols. Mongol armies. They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered, and they departed. The summary of Mongol attacks comes from a survivor of Genghis Khan's attack on the city of Bukhara, but it aptly describes a century-long campaign of conquest that made the Mongol domain the most extensive land empire the world has ever known. At its peak, Mongol territory encompassed 11 to 12 million continuous square miles of land from India to Siberia to Hungary. Driving the expansion was the indomitable personality of Genghis Khan himself, and his weapon was the tough, versatile Mongolian army. The future leader of the Eastern world was born around 1162 with the name Temujin. At the time, Mongols were fractured into warring clans, herders, hunters, and bandits who wandered the steppes. They had little in the way of Western-style culture or crafts, but they did occupy a strategic position along the Silk Road that carried trade from east to west. After a tough childhood, Temujin rapidly began to consolidate the clans and led them into a successful war against the Tatars. His ruthlessness was already evident. Following his victory, he executed every Tatar male taller than the linchpin of a wheel. In 1206, the Council of Mongol leaders named him Genghis Khan, roughly translated as strong ruler. A mobile army. Genghis drew upon his nation's inherent skills to build a superb mounted army. Like ancient Greek leaders, he organized it into units within larger units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, reporting to a top commander. Mongol armies were happy to employ trickery to win their battles, pretending to flee in disorder only to turn on their enemies. Proud of their ability to travel fast and light, they could make a meal, when necessary, of mare's milk or horse blood. When what they lacked in engineering and siege technology, they borrowed from Chinese captives and others who were conscripted to build weaponry and provide medical care. Genghis's first great campaign moved against longtime foes in China. From 1211 to 1215, he marched against Jin dynasty lands in the north, splitting his army into 3 columns that swept around Chengdu, near modern-day Beijing, capturing it in 1215. Rich with Chinese loot, he turned his attentions another direction. The conquest of Khwarezm. The Mongol leader, already well into middle age, was not always bent on conquest. He was also interested in trade with the prosperous Islamic lands to the west. Accordingly, he sent a caravan laden with gifts to the Sultan of Khwarizm, an independent Islamic nation in what is now Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. When the party entered the eastern edge of Khwarizm, the local governor seized its wares and executed the merchants. Then Sultan Muhammad of Khwarizm doubled down on this mistake. After Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to his court asking the Sultan to punish the governor, the Sultan killed some of the envoys and mutilated others. These actions unleashed a tidal wave of Mongol vengeance. As the chronicler Juvayni noted, in retribution for every hair on their heads, it seemed that 100,000 heads rolled in the dust. In 1219, Genghis rode into Khwarizm with approximately 100,000 Mongol warriors and some 50,000 allied soldiers and engineers. The Sultan had more, perhaps 200,000 to 400,000, but they proved to be no match for the smart tactics and speed of the Mongols. City after city fell to Genghis's army. Some surrendered, others held out as the Mongols barraged their walls. For the besieged populations, Genghis offered both terror and reward. Those who surrendered would be spared, those with useful skills conscripted. Those who fought would either be killed or kept alive only to serve as human shields driven before the Mongol army. The attack on the city of Bukhara was typical of Mongol tactics. Circling around the city through the desert, Genghis's army lay in wait to slaughter panicked soldiers as they fled. Genghis then summoned Bukhara's richest men and ordered them to give up their riches to his soldiers. He pounded the remaining defenders, holed up in Bukhara's citadel with stones, fire, and burning liquids. Prisoners were forced into moats to form living defensive walls. Bukhara surrendered, as did city after overwhelmed city, Samarkand, Artois, Peshawar, Astrakhan, and dozens of others. In Merv, says Juvayni, it took 13 days just to count the bodies. In 2 years, Genghis completed his conquest of Khwarizm. It was the last great campaign of his long career, though hardly the end of the Mongol Empire. After his death in 1227, his lands were divided among his sons and grandsons, who continued to dominate the empire from China to Hungary until the end of the 13th century. There he is. And a big old map of it. Old and New Worlds. Starting off with guns and gold. The great age of European exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries carried old world adventurers into the new, accompanied by weapons and disease. Emissaries from Spain and Portugal in particular set their hopes on finding gold, silver, and slave labor, first in the islands of the Caribbean and then in North and South America. Great civilizations already occupied these lands, notably the Aztec in Mexico and the Inca in Peru. They were experienced fighters, but they were caught unprepared when Spaniards arrived on horses, long extinct in North America, and bearing guns, a technology unknown in the Americas. Furthermore, both the Aztec and the Inca were rapidly weakened by an unintentional weapon, smallpox. By 1518, the disease had reached the island of Hispaniola, and it spread through Mexico and Peru in the next few years. Smallpox entered the Mexican capital of Tenochtitlan along with the conquistadors, killing approximately half of its population before the conquest was even wrapped up. Cortés takes Tenochtitlan. In 1519, the ambitious Spanish explorer Hernán Cortés sailed from Cuba to Mexico with about 600 men and 16 horses. The land was ruled by Moctezuma II, whose Aztec empire consisted of hundreds of conquered states, some none too happy with their overlord. Learning of Cortés's arrival, the Aztec emperor sent him gifts, but the Spaniard wanted more. He burned his boats to forestall any return to Cuba and set out toward the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, built on an island on Lake Texcoco. Along the way, the conquistadors fought or made alliances with native peoples formerly under Aztec control. Moctezuma did what he could to appease or block the invaders. After a gift of gold failed to stop the Spaniards, he tried sending wizards to blind them, but, wrote a chronicler, they could not dominate them in any way. In November 1519, the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan unopposed. Moctezuma greeted Cortés respectfully. Cortés placed the Aztec ruler under house arrest and took control of the city, but this initial conquest turned out to be short-lived. In 1520, the Spaniard was forced to leave Tenochtitlan to deal with a hostile Spanish expedition at the coast, and in his absence, his inept second-in-command lost control of the city. Cortés returned to find Tenochtitlan in revolt. Moctezuma was killed during the violence, and the Spaniards were forced to flee the city, weighed down by Aztec gold. Besieged by Aztec fighters with lances, pelted by stones from citizens on rooftops, most of the Spanish soldiers were killed in what the Spaniards later called the Night of Sorrows. But the Spanish were determined to reconquer Tenochtitlan. Within a year, Cortés's men had built a remarkable little fleet of sailing ships, and with the aid of Mexican allies began to besiege the lake-bound city. Starving within their walls and suffering from smallpox, the Aztec held on for a long time, at one point sacrificing Spanish captives and pulling out their hearts for the enemy to see. Nevertheless, the weakened defenders were eventually forced to surrender. In August 1521, the battle was over. Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. Approximately 100 Spaniards and 100,000 Aztec had died in the battle, and Mexico became a subject of the Spanish crown for almost 300 years. Pizarro takes Cajamarca. In 1528, Spanish King Charles V, no doubt swayed by the treasures Cortés had amassed in Mexico, made Francisco Pizarro governor of a province along South America's west coast, a land occupied, in fact, by the Inca. Pizarro, a tough middle-aged explorer, reached Peru in 1531 with fewer than 200 men, as well as horses and guns. Ruling the Inca at the time was Atahualpa. In 1532, the Inca king was camped near the town of Cajamarca with approximately 30,000 troops. Seeing no reason to fear the Spanish visitors, he agreed to meet with them in the town square. The first to approach was a priest bearing a cross and a Bible, who exhorted the Inca leader to befriend the Spanish according to God's will. Scornful, Atahualpa threw the Bible to the ground. The Spanish went on the attack. Pizarro came to the leader where Atahualpa was and fearlessly seized him by the arm, crying out, "Santiago," writes chronicler Francisco de Jerez. Then the guns were fired off, the trumpets were sounded, and the troops, both horse and foot, sallied forth. It was not so much a battle as a slaughter. In short order, the Spanish killed thousands of panicked Inca and captured their king. The Inca brought literal tons of gold and silver to Pizarro to ransom Atahualpa. The conquistador accepted the riches and then garroted the Inca leader anyway. After Atahualpa's death, the Spanish took over the capital, Cusco, and the Inca Empire fell to Spain. Triumph of the samurai. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Japan was largely isolated from the West. Although the country was nominally ruled by the emperor in Kyoto, true power lay in the hands of the local warlords, daimyo, and their elite warriors, the samurai. Samurai followed a code of conduct known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. This code required not only prowess with sword, bow, and horse, but also stoicism, fearlessness, honor, and supreme loyalty to the commander. Victorious warriors beheaded their enemies and presented those heads as trophies. Defeated warriors often, but not always, committed ritual, to redeem their disgrace. Organized by clans, these fighters had been clashing for centuries. Rival daimyo built their own castles and raided others. In the latter half of the 16th century, these battles came to a head under the leadership of three outstanding daimyo: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Nobunaga, a relatively obscure warlord, rose to prominence in 1560 with a daring attack on a rival whose armies had paused in a narrow gorge known as Okehazama. Under cover of a thunderstorm, Nobunaga's soldiers descended upon his enemies' much larger forces and defeated them within 15 minutes. Through a series of strategic family marriages and equally strategic battles, Nobunaga went on to consolidate control of many of his opponents' territories. His armies, formally split into diverse clan units, became a more centralized force with soldiers organized by function. Among them were warriors using a weapon new to Japan, the firearm. The first guns, harquebuses, had arrived with shipwrecked Portuguese sailors in 1543. Japan's skilled metal workers rapidly deciphered them and began to produce arms for the warring daimyo. In the 1575 Battle of Nagashino, Nobunaga's gunmen demonstrated their defensive value by destroying the enemy's advancing cavalry from behind a palisade. All the guns in Japan, however, could not protect Nobunaga from the traditional Japanese weapons of assassination. In 1582, he sent troops to aid an ally, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. In their absence, he was attacked by one of his generals within a temple in Kyoto. As the temple burned around him, the wounded Nobunaga took his own life. Sekigahara. Nobunaga's assassin lasted approximately 2 weeks before he in turn was destroyed by Nobunaga's ally Hideyoshi. This talented commander, the son of a woodcutter, added to Nobunaga's territories in a series of bold battles through the 1580s. He was as shrewd in peace as in war. In 1588's Great Sword Hunt, he confiscated swords from all non-samurai, claiming he needed to melt down the weapons to build a statue of the Buddha. Powerful retainers were rewarded for their service with lands far from their traditional centers of influence. Destroying the castles of his more minor rivals, he went on to build one of the great fortresses of Japan in Osaka. After 2 failed invasions of Korea in the 1590s, Hideyoshi died in 1598, leaving behind a young son and a power vacuum. Rival forces faced off to seize control. The armies to the west, commanded by Ishida Mitsunari, gathered together to take on the forces to the east, commanded by Tokugawa Ieyasu, previously one of Hideyoshi's most powerful retainers. The 2 armies met at the village of Sekigahara, northeast of Kyoto. On a foggy, rainy October morning in 1600, they engaged in a huge field battle with Ieyasu's 89,000 men against Mitsunari's 82,000. Loyalty or its absence eventually decided the conflict. 2 of Mitsunari's discontented daimyo had secretly told Ieyasu that they would not obey their leader's orders. When these troops failed to move on his command, Mitsunari was forced to retreat, and Ieyasu claimed victory. The Siege of Osaka Castle. With this battle, Ieyasu took control of Japan, and the powerless imperial court named him shogun, or military dictator, in 1603. He embarked on construction projects, including a vast castle at Edo, later Tokyo. Yet one threat still remained. Hideyoshi's heir, Hideyori, now a young man, was ensconced in Osaka Castle, surrounded by retainers and masterless samurai. Looking for a pretext to attack him, Ieyasu claimed that Hideyori had insulted his family in an inscription on a temple bell. In the winter of 1614-15, the aging Ieyasu besieged the powerful castle. As in Sekigahara, he eventually overcame his enemies through trickery, in addition to force. During a truce, Ieyasu's men filled in Osaka Castle's protective moats, and lacking this defense, the castle fell to the enemy. Hideyori and his family also took their own lives. Ieyasu died the following year, but his legacy lived on until 1867 in the Tokugawa or Edo period of Japanese history. Ieyasu's heirs established firm control over the formerly contentious warlords, and the country knew stability and economic growth. Shots heard round the world. By the 1760s, Britain should have been sitting pretty. It had land and colonies in North America and India, a powerful navy, and a widespread commercial empire. However, acquiring and holding these lands had been expensive and troublesome. Britain had won Canadian territories in the French and Indian War, but at great cost, doubling its national debt. The British Parliament thought it only reasonable to levy taxes on its American colonies to cover these expenses. The colonists disagreed. By the 1770s, the American colonies held about 2.5 million inhabitants, about 500,000 of them enslaved, and they were growing rapidly. Most colonists were farmers, and many were politically neutral, not anti-British, but not happy about paying taxes without representation either. As British subjects, they did not have their own army, and in fact, Britain housed its own armed forces on colonial soil, a fact that the colonists resented. Emotions ran particularly high in New England, whose businesses had been hard hit by new British regulations. In 1770, protesting Bostonians faced off against a handful of British redcoats in front of the custom house, and in the ensuing melee, 11 people were shot, 5 of whom died. The Boston Massacre bolstered the case of colonial patriots who argued for self-rule. By 1775, with tensions rising, aggrieved colonists from South Carolina to Massachusetts were stockpiling arms and learning rudimentary fighting skills as members of citizen militias. Lexington and Concord. On April 19, 1775, Massachusetts' Minutemen, a particularly well-trained militia group, were put to the test. British Major General Thomas Gage had learned that the colonists had stockpiled guns and powder in Concord, and sent close to 1,000 troops from Boston to confiscate the weapons. However, dispatch riders, including Paul Revere, had ridden out the night before to warn of the approaching soldiers, and dozens of Minutemen were waiting as the Redcoats marched into the town of Lexington. Someone fired a shot, possibly accidentally, and the British fired upon the Minutemen, killing or mortally wounding 8 of the colonial defenders. The colonists fled, and the British marched on to Concord to find the supplies gone and about 400 militiamen waiting for them. After a firefight, the British retreated and turned back toward Boston. Colonists harassed them along the way. The rebels kept an incessant irregular fire from all points of the column, complained British Lieutenant Frederick Mackenzie in his diary. They hardly ever fired but under cover of a stone wall, from behind a tree or out of a house, and the moment they had fired they lay down out of sight. By the time they reached safety, the Redcoats had lost more men than the colonists. Though the casualties were low compared to those in most battles, the consequences of Lexington and Concord were huge. Within a week, thousands of militiamen were on the move in Boston. The tide of public opinion began to turn toward revolution. War in the North. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress assembled delegates from 12 of the colonies. Moved rapidly. By summer, it had formally declared war, established a regular army, and appointed an experienced soldier from Virginia, George Washington, as commander of the Continental Army. Washington forced the British to leave Boston, but the Continentals went on to suffer a series of defeats in the northern and middle colonies. The British beat back the undermanned, badly equipped, and poorly trained Continental Army in Canada and New York, though Washington scored some successes in New Jersey. British commanders were encouraged by their advances against the soldiers British Major General Burgoyne described as untrained rabble. Then came the 2 battles of Saratoga in 1777. The British had planned to isolate New England by attacking from both Canada and southern New York, pinning Continental troops between their forces. However, British Generals Burgoyne and St. Leger ran into unexpected resistance in upstate New York in the late summer. Meanwhile, British General Howe decided to attack Philadelphia instead of Albany, perhaps believing that capturing the home of the Continental Congress would bring a quick end to the war. It did not. While Washington's troops settled in for a rough winter in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, Continental commanders in upstate New York fought off Burgoyne's men near the small town of Saratoga. With some 8,000 to 10,000 troops, including well-trained riflemen, Continental Commander Horatio Gates held off the British troops in desperate fighting in September and October. As time went by, the Continental troops were reinforced, while Burgoyne's men dug in. On October 7th, the Americans knocked back the British in a daring attack coordinated by General Benedict Arnold, 3 years before his defection to the British. By the 17th, the Redcoats had surrendered, giving up about 6,000 troops in a signal defeat. War in the South. The American victory at Saratoga proved to be a turning point in the war. pursuing the French to enter the war on the American side in 1778. As the British moved into the southern colonies, hoping that loyalists there would support them, the French began to attack British possessions at sea, drawing off British naval forces. Even so, the Redcoats waged successful battles in Georgia and South Carolina from 1778 to 1780. Their reliance in Southern loyalists did not pan out, though, in part because the British encouraged the Southerners' slaves to run away and join them. As American forces fought back guerrilla style in the South, American commander Nathaniel Greene rallied the Continental Army to drive the enemy toward the coast. In August 1781, the American-French alliance paid off in a big way. Seeing that the British had moved into a vulnerable position in Virginia, Washington joined with his French counterparts in a combined operation. The Continental Army, the French Army, and the French Navy, complete with French heavy artillery, combined to besiege British General Cornwallis's army in Virginia's Yorktown Peninsula. On October 19th, Cornwallis and his 7,000 men surrendered. Britain's stunning defeat at Yorktown marked the end of active land warfare in the American Revolution, though a final peace treaty was not signed until 1783. Roughly 13,000 Americans had been killed or wounded, with an astonishing 20,000 or more taken prisoner. Total British casualties, including prisoners, ran to about 24,000 men. Frontiers and freedoms. Here we go. The Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power and domination of continental Europe have made him the historical emblem of military genius, rivaled perhaps only by Alexander the Great. Between 1799, when he took power in France, and 1850, when he met his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon changed the contours of the Western world. The young Corsican rose quickly through the military ranks during and after the French Revolution. In 1799, his coup made him first consul. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor Napoleon I. France was already at war with Britain, Austria, Turkey, and Russia in 1799. But between 1802 and 1803, Napoleon entered into a brief truce with these enemies. By 1803, this unstable peace had collapsed, and Napoleon's armies began to smash through Prussia, Russia, and Austria as they expanded the French Empire. Napoleon's aggressive military tactics were just one reason for his success. He also commanded a large army, the Grande Armée. The Revolution had dissolved France's aristocratic military structure in favor of a new meritocratic system built on conscription and led by experienced officers. Its men were organized into infantry, cavalry, heavy cavalry, and dragoons, with mobile artillery. Supply trains were kept small to ensure the army's speed, and the forces could travel quickly and live off the land. Trafalgar. The Grande Armée scored one success after another in the early years of its campaigns. For instance, at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon's 68,000 troops killed and drove off 90,000 allied Russian and Austrian soldiers, forcing Austrians to make peace with the French and Russian troops to return to their homeland. For a time, only Britain presented Napoleon with a serious challenge. In October 1805, France's Admiral Pierre de Villeneuve, with 33 ships, attempted to slip out of the Spanish port of Cadiz to sail to Naples, Italy, to support Napoleon's campaigns. British Admiral Horatio Nelson's 27 ships caught up with the French off Cape Trafalgar on October 21st. The British fleet was old and battered, but Nelson counted on their superior gunnery at close quarters to bring them an advantage. Nelson's flagship Victory itself carried 104 carronades on 4 decks and was capable of sending more than a ton of iron into the enemy. Separating into 2 squadrons, the British attacked from front and rear and managed to split the French fleet. After 5 hours of fierce fighting, the British carried the day. They had captured 17 ships and 20,000 men, losing 449 sailors to the French's 4,408. One loss stood out above all others, though. Nelson himself was shot and died at 4:30 that afternoon. Russia. Though the British Royal Navy kept Napoleon on his side of the Channel, the French emperor still controlled most of Europe by 1812. Russia was the biggest remaining challenge, and that summer Napoleon led his army of 600,000 eastward, expecting that his usual tactics of speed and surprise would vanquish the underprepared Russians. But the Russians refused to play by Napoleon's rules. As he advanced, they retreated. When they did stop to fight, as at Borodino in September, the battles were exhausting. Shortly after that battle, the Grande Armée reached Moscow only to find it virtually deserted and ablaze. With Russia's Tsar Alexander refusing to enter into peace talks, Napoleon was forced to turn toward home as winter set in. Struggling along boggy roads and harassed by the Russians in bitter weather, the French army starved and stumbled. Of the hundreds of thousands who had entered Moscow, only about 100,000 men had survived to leave the city, and most of those were ill. By the time they had fought their way back into Poland, perhaps fewer than 60,000 French troops remained. Waterloo. Napoleon's Russian disaster emboldened other European states that took on the weakened army and captured Paris in 1814. Napoleon went briefly into exile on the island of Elba, but he was not suited for retirement. In March 1815, he escaped into France and won French troops back to his side. Faced with the nightmarish prospect of a resurgent Napoleon, a coalition of allied forces, including the British, Germans, Belgians, Dutch, and Prussians, pulled together to oppose him on the battlefield. On the foggy, muddy morning of June 18, 1815, British-led forces, which included Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, met Napoleon's army near the Belgian town of Waterloo. Their Prussian allies were delayed, and Napoleon was encouraged. "This affair is nothing more than eating breakfast," he said. And yet the British, led by Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, held off the French until the Prussians arrived, and in heavy fighting Napoleon was driven off. In June he abdicated and was sent into exile, this time permanently, on the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena. War for the Plains. American settlers moving west in search of golden farmland began to clash with the American Indian inhabitants of the plains in the mid-19th century. Bloody battles between settlers guarded by armed forces and their Plains Indians opponents lasted from the 1850s until the 1890s. But perhaps the most famous of these conflicts was a rare Indian victory in 1876, known as the Battle of the Little Bighorn. From Minnesota to Texas, people such as the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Comanche resisted U.S. efforts to force them onto reservations or simply eliminate them. In 1864, for instance, Colorado volunteers commanded by Colonel John Chivington attacked an unsuspecting band of Cheyenne in Sand Creek, where they were supposedly under the governor's protection, saying, "We must kill them big and little." Chivington massacred women and children along with warriors. In 1866, the Teton or Lakota Sioux, in their turn, wiped out U.S. soldiers on the Bozeman Trail in Wyoming, killing close to 80 men. In 1868, some Lakota Sioux and Arapaho leaders agreed to the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, which created a reservation in western South Dakota. Others rejected the offer and remained on their hunting grounds near the Powder River. In any event, the promise of sanctuary lasted no more than 7 years. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills brought miners into Sioux territory in violation of the treaty, and in 1875 the Commissioner of Indian Affairs ordered all Sioux to confine themselves to the reservation by the end of January 1876. The Little Bighorn. Many of the Indians refused to move. In March, 3 forces of cavalry and infantry advanced out of forts in Montana and the Dakota and Wyoming territories. They included Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, commanding the 7th Cavalry. Custer was known for his reckless behavior and checkered career. Promoted to Major General during the Civil War, he was court-martialed in 1867 and reinstated in 1868. Custer and his commander, Brigadier General Alfred Terry, planned to surround an Indian village on the Little Bighorn River. Believing the enemy to have on the order of 800 men, the U.S. soldiers did not anticipate a major battle. However, the village of Lakota Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne people numbered about 7,000, including perhaps 2,000 warriors. "I did not think anyone would come and attack us so strong as we were," said Oglala Lakota fighter Low Dog later. On June 25th, Custer divided his forces into several companies. Two attacked the southern end of the village. They were driven back by their mounted opponents, including legendary warrior Crazy Horse, who raced his horse directly in front of the army gunmen in an act of bravado known as a brave run. To the east of the river, in rough terrain, Custer's 210 men were completely wiped out. The Indians then left the camp and the bodies for General Terry to discover on June 27th. The defeat at the Little Bighorn only intensified U.S. antagonism against the Indians. Indian alliance broke apart, and most of the Plains Indians were confined to reservations by the 1880s. Brother against brother. By far the bloodiest conflict on American soil, the Civil War cost at least 620,000 lives between 1861 and 1865, or 2% of the entire population. It also settled some thorny issues facing a nation less than 100 years old. Was the United States a loose coalition of independent entities, or a single country under a central government? And should slavery continue to exist within this country? In the mid-19th century, the cotton-dependent southern economy and westward expansion had brought these questions to the fore. By 1850, slaves produced more than 90% of the cotton on southern plantations. By 1860, the South had held more than 4 million enslaved people, while Southerners felt increasingly threatened by the primarily northern abolitionist movement. New territories and states west of the Mississippi added fuel to partisan flames as they became virtual battlegrounds between pro-slavery and pro-abolition forces. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln declared that this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. When he was elected president in 1860, Southern politicians decided to put that declaration to the test. By February 1861, 7 Southern states had seceded from the Union and had set up their own provisional government as the Confederate States of America. On April 12th, Confederate forces opened fire in South Carolina on the Union's Fort Sumter and Charleston Harbor, and the war began. First Bull Run and the Early War. Fort Sumter fell to the Confederates on April 13th, and by April 15th, Lincoln called on 75,000 militiamen to enlist for the Union. Additional southern states, including Virginia, joined the Confederacy. On paper, at least, the North had the advantage in any conflict. The Union had many more citizens, greater resources, and a superior navy. However, the South had vast territories, solid popular support, and at least, at first, better generals. Any notion that the war would be over soon was quashed by its first major land battle on July 21, 1861. Untested Union troops under the command of Union Brigadier General Irvin McDowell met equally green Confederates led by Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard on the banks of Bull Run Creek near Manassas, Virginia. McDowell's men crossed the stream and attacked Beauregard's left flank, while a fellow officer, Colonel William T. Sherman, crossed near Stone Bridge. The Union troops drove the Confederates to Henry Hill, but under Confederate Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson, soon to earn the sobriquet Stonewall. I've never heard that word before. The rebels held firm. In a defensive position, their accurate rifled muskets and deadly artillery, employing canister shells, gave them the advantage that would be repeated throughout the war. With reinforcements in the afternoon, the Confederates drove the Federal troops back to an increasingly panicked disarray all the way to Washington. Confederate casualties ran to 1,750 men, the United States about 2,950. By later standards, the death toll was low, but it was clear that the war would be long and hard fought. Stalemate and Antietam. In the months after First Bull Run, Lincoln made General George B. McClellan commander of the Union forces. Close to 1 million men faced off from Virginia to Missouri, while the Union Navy established a blockade along the southeastern coast. Lincoln and McClellan still had some hope that the Confederate states might be persuaded to rejoin the Union, but as the months went by, those hopes faded. The year 1862 brought a series of huge and bloody battles, which included bold offenses from the talented Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The conflicts included the single bloodiest day of fighting in American history, the the Battle of Antietam on September 17th. Lee's forces had skirted Washington and entered Maryland, where they split into 5 parts to capture several targets. Had McClellan moved quickly, his larger forces might have picked off the separate Confederate units, but a cautious commander, he did not press this advantage. Instead, Lee pulled together his army and met the Union near Antietam Creek in Sharpsburg, Maryland. Intense fighting through cornfields and across bridges raged through the day. Although McClellan had the numerical advantage, he again hesitated to send in all his men, and by the end of the day, the armies had fought to a standstill. Lee pulled his Army of Northern Virginia back across the Potomac on September 18th. About 6,000 men had been killed and another 17,000 or so wounded. The partial Union victory at Antietam had far-reaching effects. Having vowed that he would declare freedom for slaves if Lee was driven back, Abraham Lincoln issued an Emancipation Proclamation stating that unless the Confederate States returned to the Union, all slaves in rebel territories would be freed as of January 1st, 1863. It did not apply to states outside the Confederacy. But it was nevertheless a revolutionary document, fundamentally changing the course of American history. Vicksburg, Gettysburg, and Total War. In the middle of 1863, the war reached a brutal peak, and with a pair of key battles, the tide began to turn in favor of the Union. From May 18th through July 4th, an aggressive Union general in the West, Ulysses S. Grant, besieged the strategically crucial city of Vicksburg above the Mississippi. With the city's surrender on July 4th, followed shortly by neighboring Port Hudson, the Union took control of the river and split the Confederacy in two. While Vicksburg suffered through its final days, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee met with the Union Army of the Potomac under General George Gordon Meade at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. At first, Lee's forces drove back the Union men, but by July 3rd, the Union was repelling Confederate attacks with huge casualties on both sides. On July 4th, Lee retreated toward Virginia with a line of wounded stretching for miles. The total killed and wounded numbered 51,000. With Grant named General-in-Chief of the Union armies in 1864, the Union embarked on campaigns of all-out war and destruction on Southern resources. While Grant fought in Virginia, Sherman tore through Georgia to the sea, destroying bridges, tearing up railroad lines, and pillaging farms. Short on supplies and short on soldiers, the Confederacy lost a series of battles in Virginia in April 1865, culminating in a final skirmish near Appomattox Courthouse. On the afternoon of April 9th, Robert E. Lee signed the terms of surrender, which gave all Confederate soldiers parole if they pledged no longer to take up arms against the United States. The war was over, though animosity lived on. The world on fire. Starting with the war to end war. World War I utterly erased any idea that war was a game of courtly strategy played by honorable men. Lasting from 1914 to 1918, the war was a wholesale slaughter, leaving approximately 9 million soldiers and at least 6 million civilians dead. More than half of all combatants were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The First World War introduced new weapons and new forms of transportation, making it the first truly modern war. Machine guns, invented in the late 19th century, fired 600 bullets a minute. Rapid-fire field artillery rained down shells on men in trenches. Aircraft became bomb delivery systems. Submarines took a toll on enemy shipping. And chemical weapons brought choking death to the battleground. The war's causes were complex, but historians agree that they lay in the alliances that sprang up in the years of European imperialism. The Triple Alliance, or Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, distrusted the Triple Entente, or allies of Britain, France, and Russia. The war's precipitating event was the June 1914 assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist during a visit to Sarajevo. In July, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Serbia's ally Russia began to mobilize for war, and Germany declared war on Russia and France in August. The Battle of the Marne. At first, many expected the war to be over promptly. German commanders intended to follow a strategy known as the Schlieffen Plan, in which defensive forces would hold the line against Russia while larger numbers of offensive forces would zip through neutral Belgium and knock out France. The plan failed almost immediately. Belgian forces put up a strong resistance. German troops were unable to conquer Paris, and the British, not willing to see Germans just across the Channel, entered the war. The first major battle, the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, set the course of the war. The Germans were within 30 miles of Paris when they met up with the French army and the British Expeditionary Force. In a nighttime attack, the French moved into a gap between the German 1st and 2nd armies. The Germans retreated north of the Aisne River and literally dug in, settling into trenches. With this battle, the war's momentum stalled, and the conflict became a long, miserable slog of trench warfare. Although conflicts took place in other parts of the world, the primary line of battle was the Western Front, a line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. In these muddy shelters, soldiers endured boredom, disease, and terror. The War of Attrition. For 3 brutal years, both sides fought a war of attrition, racking up casualties in lieu of gaining ground. The numbers killed were staggering. The Battle of Verdun, for instance, ground through French and German troops for 10 months in 1916. More than 20 million artillery shells were fired, as well as a dreadful new weapon, shells filled with phosgene gas. The battle also saw the first wartime use of flamethrowers. By the time the French retook the fortified French town of Verdun in December, close to 1 million men had been killed or wounded. Dovetailing with Verdun was the Battle of the Somme, which pitted the Allies against the Germans between July and November 1916. On the first day alone, almost 20,000 British soldiers were killed following a misguided advance across the no-man's land between the lines. Over the next months, the Allied forces moved forward no more than 7 miles, and both sides together lost more than 1 million men to death or capture. Turning points. Prompted in part by the threat of German U-boats, America finally entered the war on the side of the Allies in April 1917. Even before the first American soldiers reached Europe, U.S. money and supplies began to turn the tide. Desperate to gain ground before American troops arrived, the Germans pulled in soldiers from the Eastern Front and advanced on Paris, but were eventually held off by the French army. On August 8, 1918, Allied forces, including Americans, launched coordinated attacks across the Western Front in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. Airplanes and primitive tanks overflew and overran German trenches, and the Germans were forced to fall back. The fighting was no less bloody for being more mobile. Each side suffered more than 1 million casualties. More than 26,000 Americans were killed in the Meuse-Argonne portion of the campaign, to date still the deadliest campaign in American military history. German General Erich Ludendorff informed the German government that it must ask for peace. On November 11, 1918, the two sides signed an armistice, and the war to end war was itself ended. The world divided. Europe. Between its defeat in World War I and early 1930s, Germany was weakened and demoralized. The Treaty of Versailles, signed by the Allied powers and Germany in 1919, reduced Germany's land area, required reparations from the defeated country, and severely restricted its army and weaponry. But the treaty was toothless without enforcement. After Nazi Party leader Adolf Hitler became German Chancellor in 1933, he began to rebuild the armed forces and formed an alliance with Italian dictator Benito Mussolini without encountering serious resistance from the former allies. Hitler's racist ideology was that the so-called Aryan race deserved Lebensraum. Rooster. That scared me. Or living space, carved out of Slavic states to Germany's east. In March and September 1938, Germany annexed Austria and then part of Czechoslovakia in bloodless takeovers. To forestall, there goes the rooster, to ignore that. To forestall a two-front war in August, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, which itself was trying to buy time to build up its own forces while fending off German expansion. The agreement gave Hitler the protection he needed to invade Poland, which he did on September 1st, 1939. This forced Britain and France to declare war. Blitzkrieg. The invasion of Poland showcased the German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Using aircraft support, motorized divisions, columns of panzer tanks, and 1.5 million troops, Germany cut quickly through Polish lines, with the Soviets invading eastern Poland, secretly ceded to them by the Non-Aggression Pact. The end came soon, and Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country between them by the end of September. A 6-month lull in fighting ended in April 1940, when German forces turned west and began to blaze through Norway, Denmark, and the neutral Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. German motorized divisions swept into a poorly prepared France. French forces ensconced behind the Maginot Line, defenses stretching from Switzerland to Belgium, were overcome. On June 14th, the Germans captured Paris, which surrendered on June 22nd. To be divided between the German-occupied coastal region and a collaborating regime in the south. The world at war. The war spread rapidly, not only across Europe, but also into North Africa. In June 1940, Hitler's ally Mussolini jumped into the conflict, and Italian troops invaded Greece and Egypt. Meanwhile, Hitler's air force, the Luftwaffe, attempted to destroy Britain's Royal Air Force and ground resources during the Battle of Britain. With heavy losses on both sides, the British fought them off and the Germans retreated. In June 1941, Hitler broke his non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union and invaded Russia in search of his Lebensraum. Like Napoleon before him, he would find the vast territory and die-hard Russian resistance impossible to overcome. In campaigns that dragged on through 1944, German troops tried and failed to take Leningrad and Moscow. In hard-fought Stalingrad, Soviet troops trapped the Germans within the ruined city and starved them into surrender. "The horses have already been eaten," wrote a German soldier in his diary. "I would eat a cat. They say its meat is also tasty. The soldiers look like corpses or lunatics looking for something to put in their mouths." Axis, meaning German and Allied casualties, exceeded 800,000. Soviet casualties, more than 1 million. Even as Germany was at war from Britain to the Soviet Union, within its conquered lands it was carrying out a campaign of genocide. Mass killings of Jews began in 1941, and soon the Nazis began mass deportations of Jewish residents to concentration camps, forced labor camps, and killing centers, many of them in occupied Poland. 6 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of others, including Romani, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and people with disabilities, were murdered before the war's end. Turning points. While war ravaged Europe, Hitler's Japanese allies launched an attack on U.S. ships at Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. entered the war in 1941. With America in the fray, the Axis powers began to crumble. British and American troops took southern Italy in 1943 and 1944, and on D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, an invasion of France that began on the shores of Normandy. With heavy fire, more than 150,000 Allied troops waded ashore. The beach was a total chaos with men's bodies everywhere, recalled a U.S. officer later. It sounded like a beehive with the bullets flying around. Once on land, the Allies managed to liberate Holland, Belgium, and France, with Paris retaken on August 25th. A German counterattack in December, the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, failed to stop the Allied advance. American troops crossed the Rhine on March 1945, as they and the Soviets swept into a bombed-out German landscape from west to east in April 1945. Adolf Hitler took his life in the Berlin bunker along with other top Nazi officials. In May, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. The world divided, the Pacific. World War II truly spanned the globe after Japan decided to enter the conflict. Searching for natural resources it lacked at home, the militaristic country had seized Manchuria in 1931 and followed up with further invasions of the Chinese mainland in 1937. In response, the United States imposed economic sanctions on Japan. Japan decided to drive Americans and Europeans out of Southeast Asia and its waters once and for all. In a devastating first strike, it launched a surprise air attack on the United States Naval Base at Hawaii's Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Two waves of approximately 360 Japanese aircraft bombed and strafed the U.S. airfields and ships at anchor that morning. They destroyed more than 180 aircraft on the ground, damaged all the U.S. battleships and sank two, and killed more than 2,400 servicemen. The next day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared war on Japan. On December 11th, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States. The Island War. World War II in the Pacific was a new kind of conflict for the combatants, requiring an unprecedented display of naval and air power. The opponents employed battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers, submarines, and an array of aircraft to wage war from below the ocean surface to high above the clouds. The first months of the war went poorly for the Allies, mostly U.S. forces, as they tried to contain Japanese expansion. Japan quickly took Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and then the Philippines, Singapore, and Burma, among other territories. Conditions were grim for soldiers who landed amid jungles and ravines on Pacific islands. In the Philippines, for instance, thousands of Allied prisoners of war died on a march along the Bataan Peninsula to a prison camp. By the middle of 1942, the Allies began to turn back the Japanese advance. American code breakers intercepted Japanese messages that revealed an upcoming attack on the American atoll of Midway. The Japanese hoped to wipe out the Pacific Fleet and then move on to Hawaii, but dive bombers under the command of American Admiral Chester Nimitz, forewarned, managed to destroy 4 valuable Japanese aircraft carriers. Ingenious landing craft known as Higgins boats helped Allied troops land safely on Pacific beaches, and they proved instrumental in the next Great Pacific Battle on the island of Guadalcanal. For 6 months, from August 1942 to February 1943, the United States and Japan fought a series of major battles on land, sea, and in the air, with the Allies eventually prevailing and securing supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. The Allies were now on the offensive. From 1943 through 1944, they followed an island-hopping strategy in the Southwest Pacific, taking one island after another, and building a line of secure locations that blocked the Japanese from their supplies. Meanwhile, other Allied forces advanced through the Central Pacific into the Marshall and Mariana Islands, moving ever closer to Japan itself. Leyte Gulf? Let's say Leyte. I don't know that one. U.S. Army General Douglas MacArthur had been driven out of the Philippines in 1942, and he was determined to retake the archipelago from the Japanese. On October 1944, he got his way, and the Allies retook the islands in the largest naval battle in modern history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. By the end, the Japanese had lost 26 warships, and the United States lost 7, along with more than 20,000 soldiers and sailors killed. The Japanese Navy was severely crippled, although the battle did see the first deployment of a new and fearsome weapon, the kamikaze plane. Pilots on these aircraft, loaded with bombs and extra gasoline, made suicidal crashes into U.S. warships, sinking 34 ships and killing almost 5,000 sailors by the end of the war. Nuclear fire. Despite the victory in the Philippines, the Allies still faced a fierce defense from the Japanese in 1945 on islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. On Okinawa alone, American casualties were close to 50,000. U.S. bombers pummeled Japan. In March, incendiaries destroyed close to 16 square miles of Tokyo. The United States prepared for a difficult land invasion of Japan, but a terrifying new weapon made that final offensive unnecessary. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the U.S. Army Air Force dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively. The initial blasts, firestorms, and radiation sickness killed at least 120,000 people, most of them civilians. Japan formally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. In all, World War II was the most widespread and destructive conflict in history. Almost 30 countries joined in. The final death toll is unclear, but roughly 15 million people were killed in battle, and perhaps 45 million civilians died from Norway to Papua New Guinea. An undeclared war. America's long and dismaying conflict in Vietnam showed, among other things, that even a mighty military force can fail if it goes into war with murky motives, few allies, and a motivated enemy. Including Vietnamese civilians, millions died in a conflict that lost its support at home before the fighting ended. In 1954, after a lengthy struggle, the countries of Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia broke free from France. According to the Geneva Accords, Vietnam would temporarily be broken into northern and southern countries along the 17th parallel to be reunified following elections in 1956. This prospect alarmed U.S. leaders who in those Cold War years feared the spread of communism. As President Dwight D. Eisenhower described it, "You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly." Accordingly, the United States began to support the unpopular but anti-communist South Vietnamese government. Meanwhile, a resistance group grew within South Vietnam. Called the National Liberation Front, its soldiers later came to be known among its opponents as the Viet Cong. The unifying election never happened, and in the early 1960s, the United States, under President John F. Kennedy, began to send increasing numbers of American military advisors into South Vietnam to support the fight against the pro-communist guerrillas. Escalation. In 1964, the conflict began to escalate when a reported attack on American ships on the Gulf of Tonkin gave President Lyndon Johnson the pretext to enter into a more full-fledged war, though without a formal declaration. The conflict that burned through the next 10 years looked very different from the huge set battles of World War II. South Vietnam, with its swampy south and jungle-covered mountainous central highlands, was inhospitable to land travel. Dense forest and tall elephant grass hid the enemy until they were a few feet away. Therefore, American forces relied heavily on air power. Helicopters and warplanes dominated the war. By the end of the conflict, aircraft such as the B-52 Stratofortress had rained a greater weight of bombs onto North Vietnamese cities than were dropped into Germany during World War II. The United States also dropped the incendiary weapon napalm on North Vietnamese positions. Although napalm had been used since World War II, the weapon's indiscriminate harm to civilians horrified both the American public and the soldiers themselves. The Battle of Nha Trang Valley in 1965 exemplified the difficulty of fighting in South Vietnamese terrain. From November 14th to 17th, the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division fought soldiers of North Vietnam's People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, in the tall grass of the rugged Central Highlands. Intending to eliminate a PAVN supply point, American forces dropped by helicopter into 2 landing zones. Within an hour, more than 1,000 PAVN troops attacked. Although the Americans had air support, fighting on the ground was fierce and at times even involved hand-to-hand combat in the grass. Friend and foe became so intertwined that American artillery could not always be brought to bear. By the 17th, fighting had ended with more than 300 U.S. casualties and perhaps 1,000 PAVN killed. Both sides claimed victory, but the battle showed that combat would be tough and inconclusive. The Tet Offensive. By 1968, almost 500,000 American troops were serving in Vietnam alongside more than 700,000 soldiers of the South Vietnamese Army, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or the ARVN. In late January, at the time of the Lunar New Year, or the Tet holiday, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops launched a coordinated offensive against scores of South Vietnamese cities and towns, including the ancient city of Hue and the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. North Vietnamese soldiers even managed to breach the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon in an attack that shocked the American public. The offensive sputtered out with major North Vietnamese casualties, but it marked a turning point. Facing growing public opposition and seeing no clear end in sight, American President Richard Nixon decided to gradually turn the fighting over to South Vietnamese troops and pull Americans out of the conflict. Despite this decision, Nixon aroused even more homegrown opposition when he ordered invasions into Cambodia and Laos in 1970 and 1971, and continued the heavy bombing of North Vietnam in 1972. In January 1973, the United States and forces representing North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed an agreement to end the war. Despite the agreement, North Vietnamese forces continued to attack the South. On April 30th, 1975, the North invaded Saigon, and American and South Vietnamese civilians fled the city via helicopter from the embassy's rooftop. In all, more than 58,000 American men and women died in the war, as well as more than 1 million Vietnamese fighters on both sides, and perhaps 2 million civilians. Shield and Storm. The Persian Gulf War, fought in 1990 to 1991, played out in two parts. The first phase, known as Desert Shield, saw a buildup of defensive forces in Saudi Arabia. The second, Desert Storm, took place over 6 weeks of air and ground action against Iraqi forces in the battle to liberate Kuwait. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded his neighbor Kuwait, seeking to add the small country's vast oil reserves to his own total. His invasion quickly succeeded and aroused alarm among world leaders, particularly in Saudi Arabia next door, which feared for its own oil fields. The United Nations demanded Iraq's immediate withdrawal, while the coalition of armed forces led by the United States began to deploy to Saudi Arabia. Iraq refused to retreat and, in fact, built up its own forces inside Kuwait. On January 17, 1991, the battles of Desert Storm began. Desert Storm. Iraqi forces were well equipped, not least because the United States had supplied them with weapons during their long war with Iran in the 1980s. Iraq had perhaps 300,000 troops stationed in Kuwait, along with thousands of tanks and artillery weapons. UN forces, though, greatly outnumbered them. The coalition fielded about 700,000 troops, thousands of combat aircraft and tanks, and more than 100 naval vessels in the Persian Gulf. The first 5 weeks of Desert Storm consisted primarily of an air war. The United States and allies flew more than 100,000 combat sorties and dropped more than 88,500 tons of bombs on Iraqi combat facilities, government buildings, and forces in Iraq and Kuwait. Iraq attempted to change the course of the war by launching surface-to-surface Scud missiles against Israel, which had abstained from the conflict, as well as against targets in Saudi Arabia. The attacks, though impressive and well televised, did not help Iraq in the end. Among the more remarkable Allied air campaigns was the secret extra-long-distance mission officially known as Senior Surprise, but nicknamed Secret Squirrel. Taking off on the first day of the air war, 7 B-52 Stratofortresses flew 14,000 miles non-stop for more than 35 hours from Louisiana to Iraq and back, refueling in flight to launch GPS-guided cruise missiles toward Iraqi targets. 100 hours. By the end of February, the air attacks had significantly weakened Iraqi forces that, in a Pyrrhic gesture, set fire to hundreds of Kuwait's oil wells. On the 24th, UN forces began a swift and overwhelming land offensive into Kuwait. Operating through the night using night vision goggles, pressing forward through dust storms, coalition tanks and helicopters moved rapidly into the occupied territory. From the Saudi-Iraqi border, one wave of armored forces swung around in a left hook through Iraqi defenses on the border. The other moved straight north into Kuwait. Led by U.S., French, and Arab armored and mechanized divisions, the coalition forces reached Kuwait City within 2 days. Dispirited Iraqi soldiers put up little resistance. On February 28th, the coalition halted military action, and on March 3rd, the opposing sides agreed to a ceasefire. The coalition had lost somewhat more than 300 fighters during the brief conflict, versus an estimated tens of thousands of Iraqi deaths. And that is the end of our book. so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope you have a very good night.